A lonely farmer rescued two blindfolded horses, and what happened next shocked the entire town. What would make a person who has lost all hope fight for their life again? Sometimes the answer does not come in the form of words or signs from above. Sometimes it smells like rotten straw, fear, and death. For Arseny Petrovich, a 62-year-old farmer living out his days in complete solitude, that answer came in the deafening silence of an old, abandoned barn on the very edge of his property. The July sun was at its zenith. The air was melting from the heat, and even the flies buzzed lazily and reluctantly. Arseny was walking to cut the path when his ear caught a faint, barely discernible sound. It was not the mooing of a cow or the bleating of a sheep. It was a faint, intermittent snorting, full of despair. The barn door gave way with a long creak, letting in a pillar of dusty light. A heavy, suffocating smell hit his nose, and then he saw them. In the dim light stood two shadows, two skeletons covered in skin. But the most terrifying thing was not their protruding ribs and sunken sides. The most terrifying thing was on their heads. Thick, dirty bags made of coarse fabric were tightly tied with ropes, completely depriving them of sight. Before we continue, let us know what city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. Arseny Petrovich froze on the threshold. For many years, he had lived as if in a dream. After the accident that took his wife and daughter, the world lost its color for him. He mechanically did his job, ate, slept, feeling neither joy nor sorrow. He simply existed. But the sight of these blind, defenseless creatures pierced his armor. Something inside him, long dormant and dead, stirred. He slowly stepped forward. The horses jerked, digging their hooves into the sticky mud. He began to speak to them in a quiet voice that had not been used for a long time. It was the voice he had once used to calm his little daughter. He spoke simple, meaningless words, slowly approaching them. One of the horses, a bay mare, trembled all over. The second, a powerful black gelding, just stood there with his head bowed low, as if in surrender. Arseny stretched out his calloused, earth-smelling hand and gently touched the mare's neck. She did not recoil. Then he began to untie the knots. The rope dug into the skin, leaving bloody furrows. When the sack fell to the ground, the horse shook its head wildly, blinded even by the dim light of the barn. Its eyes, huge and full of terror, stared into the void. Getting them outside was a real challenge. They staggered, their legs buckling from weakness. In the bright sunlight, they looked even more terrifying. Their coats were matted, their skin covered with abrasions and old scars. The bay mare took a few steps and collapsed to the ground, unable to stand. A black gelding remained nearby, nudging her with his nose. And then Arseny Petrovich realized that he couldn't do it alone. He took an old push-button phone out of his pocket, found a faded number in his notebook, and for the first time in 5 years, turned to someone for help and pressed the call button. A cheerful female voice answered on the other end of the line. "Veterinary service, Anna Sergeyevna speaking." Arseny swallowed the lump in his throat. "Anya, it's Petrovich. Come quickly. I've got trouble." He couldn't say another word. Anna Sergeyevna, the local veterinarian, had known Arseny for a long time. She knew his story and his voluntary seclusion. She rushed over in 20 minutes, and what she saw made her, an experienced woman accustomed to many things, freeze in shock. "My God, Petrovich, where did you get them?" was all she could manage to say as she took a box of medicines out of her car. Anna worked quickly and professionally. Examination, injections, IV. Her diagnosis was grim: extreme exhaustion and dehydration. She explained to Arseny that feeding them regular food at this point would be deadly. They needed special concoctions, small portions, and constant monitoring. While she was busy with the animals, the news had already spread throughout Zarachensky. The small town was abuzz with rumors. Someone had seen the veterinarian's car at the recluse Petrovich's house. Someone had heard strange noises. By evening, a story had been concocted and embellished with details. The old man had lost his mind, brought dead horses to the farm, and was now spreading disease throughout the district. Arseny did not hear the gossip. He was completely absorbed in his new concern. He named the dapple-gray mare Zarya and the black gelding Buran. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the barn on an overturned bucket, changing the water, pouring medicinal broth into the feed trough, and simply talking to them. He told them about his life, about the weather, about how tomorrow would definitely be better. He didn't know if they understood him, but he felt it was necessary. The horses, exhausted and weak, gradually calmed down to the sound of his voice. And in the morning, a small miracle happened. When Arseny entered the barn, Zarya, who had been unable to stand yesterday, tried to get up to meet him. The next day, the local police officer arrived at the farm. The young, fit Lieutenant Igor Belov was new to Zarachensk, having been transferred from the regional center. He didn't know the local stories or unwritten rules. He saw only the facts: cruel treatment of animals. Belov was meticulous and thorough. He examined the horses, the barn, and questioned Arseny. One detail caught his attention more than anything else. "Their eyes were tied, Petrovich," he said, making notes in his notebook. "They weren't just abandoned. They were transported like this, secretly, so they wouldn't make any noise or get their bearings. That means the crime was planned." Igor opened a case, but immediately realized that it would be difficult. No one had seen anything. No reports of missing horses had been filed in the area. He sent inquiries to neighboring regions, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. During the inspection, something on Zari's neck, under her matted mane, caught his attention. Anna Sergeevna carefully shaved the wool in that spot. The outline of an old, almost overgrown brand appeared on the skin. It was impossible to make out, but its very presence indicated that the mare was not just a simple village horse. It was the first serious lead, but it didn't lead anywhere yet. The days passed in a new routine. Arseny lived according to a schedule dictated by his concern for Zari and Buran. Every 3 hours, it was feeding time. Twice a day, there was cleaning and the procedures prescribed by Anna. And he began to change. His slumped back straightened. A sparkle appeared in his dull eyes. He began to notice how the sun rose and set, how the cut grass smelled, how the birds sang. He tidied up the yard, repaired the fence, and mowed the weeds around the house. It was as if, together with the horses, he was bringing his own farm and himself back to life. The horses slowly but surely recovered. Buran, calm and phlegmatic, followed Arseny like a faithful dog. Zarya, however, remained fearful and distrustful. She shuddered at every sharp sound and let no one near her except Arseny. But one evening, as he was brushing her, she suddenly laid her head trustingly on his shoulder and sighed softly. At that moment, Arseny Petrovich felt the ice in his heart finally crack. Anna, who came almost every day, watched this triple metamorphosis with amazement. "You didn't just save them, Petrovich," she said one day. "You saved each other." And then something happened that shook the whole town. One warm evening, Arseny took the horses out to a large meadow behind the farm for the first time. Zarya, feeling the soft grass and open space under her hooves, suddenly raised her head. Her ears pricked up, her nostrils flared. She whinnied, loud, clear, joyful, and in the next second, she took off. It was not the run of an exhausted animal. It was flight. A light, graceful, swift gallop of a thoroughbred horse. She raced across the meadow, her dark coat glistening in the rays of the setting sun. Burin ran after her, heavily but persistently. And at the edge of the field stood a lonely old farmer, smiling for the first time in many years, it seemed. A teenager passing by accidentally captured this scene on his phone. The video ended up in a local social media group with the caption, "Our reclusive neighbor is working miracles." Overnight, the video gained thousands of views. By morning, people's attitude toward Arseny had changed. He went from being an oddball to a hero. People started coming to the farm, some with bags of oats, some with carrots, some just to look and shake his hand. Arseny was embarrassed and tried to brush them off. But deep down, he was warmed by this belated human attention. Arseny's fame reached the most influential person in the area, Stepan Viktorovich Gromov, owner of the Zarya Agricultural Holding. Gromov was the local king and god. He gave people jobs, sponsored city festivals, and no serious issue in the administration was decided without his knowledge. One day, a shiny black SUV pulled up to Arseny's farm. Gromov himself got out, tall, confident, with a masterful smile on his face. He shook Arseny's hand, praised him for his good work, and looked at the horses. "I've heard about your feat, Petrovich," he boomed. "Well done. Our city needs heroes like you. I've decided to help out a little." He handed Arseny a thick envelope with money. Arseny refused the money. "I don't need it. People help how they can." Gromov did not insist. He walked around the yard, patted Burin on the neck. His gaze lingered on Zarya. Something cold flashed in his eyes, something Arseny could not quite make out. "Well, take care, Petrovich." Gromov said goodbye. "You're doing a good thing. Just make sure those nags don't bite you in the ass. Animals are unpredictable." Arseny thought he detected a veiled threat in his words. When Gromov's car drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust, Arseny looked at the logo on the door. It was an image of the rising sun and the words, "Agro Holding Zarya." He had given the same name to the mare he had rescued. A chill ran down his spine at the coincidence. That evening, Arseny decided to finally clean up the old barn where he had found the horses. Raking out the moldy, rotten straw, he stumbled upon something hard. It was a small metal object. Arseny wiped it on his pant leg. In his hand lay a gold-plated tie clip. Expensive, stylish, completely out of place in this abandoned place. The clip was engraved with an ornate monogram, 2 intertwined letters, C and V. Arseny turned the find over in his hands and, not thinking much of it, put it in his pocket. He didn't remember it until 2 days later, when he was watching the evening news on the local channel. There was a report on a charity auction organized by Stepan Viktorovich Gromov. "Patron and benefactor," the announcer said enthusiastically. The camera zoomed in on Gromov, who was giving a speech about the importance of kindness and mercy. And on his silk tie, Arseny saw the exact same clip with the initials SV. The blood drained from his face. Everything fell into place. The threatening words, the name of the agricultural holding company, and now this piece of evidence. He, a simple lone farmer, against the most powerful man in the area. Fear gripped his heart like an icy vice. He took the clip out of his pocket. The small piece of metal now felt as heavy as a stone. He could have thrown it away, pretended he hadn't found anything, and gone on living his life. But images of Zari and Buran, tortured and with bags over their heads, flashed before his eyes. He knew he couldn't do that. Overcoming his fear, Arseny called the local police officer. Igor Belov arrived immediately. He listened to Arseny silently, examined the clamp, and packed it into a special bag. "This is serious, Petrovich," he said. "This is direct evidence. But it's not enough on its own. We need a witness." Igor threw himself into the case with renewed energy. Now he had a lead. He began searching for Gromov's former employees, especially those who had dealt with horses. Most of them refused to talk, fearing revenge from their powerful former boss. But Igor was persistent. He learned that several months earlier, Gromov had fired his old stableman, accusing him of drunkenness. Igor found the man, drunk and destitute, in a village on the outskirts of the district. The conversation was long and difficult. But in the end, with a promise of protection, the former stableman spoke. And his story was horrific. Zaria, he said, was an elite racehorse nicknamed Star of Dawn, which Gromov had bought for a pittance after she suffered a serious leg injury. He decided he could quickly get her back on her feet with illegal stimulants and brutal training methods so he could enter her in underground races with huge stakes. But the injury turned out to be more serious. When it became clear that she would never race again, Gromov decided to simply get rid of her. He didn't want to spend money on a vet and euthanasia. Buran was just an old workhorse that had been written off for the sake of appearances. The groom himself, on Gromov's orders, put bags over their heads and loaded them into a van. He didn't know where they were being taken, but he guessed that it wouldn't end well. After receiving official testimony, Igor realized it was time to act. He sent all the materials to the regional administration, demanding support and a search warrant. Meanwhile, Gromov apparently sensed that the clouds were gathering. The pressure on Arseny intensified. One evening, while he was feeding the horses, a black SUV with no license plates pulled up to his gate. Two burly men in tracksuits got out. They did not threaten him directly. They simply conveyed greetings from Stepan Viktorovich. "The boss asked me to tell you," one of them said through gritted teeth, "that you're playing with fire, and that the horses sometimes disappear again, accidentally. You understand?" After they left, Arseny didn't sleep a wink all night, sitting by the window with his grandfather's rifle, guarding his rescued friends. He was afraid, but for the first time in many years, he was ready to defend what was dear to him. He didn't know that the denouement of this story would come very soon and would be much louder than he could have imagined. 2 days later, Zarichensk celebrated City Day. As always, Stepan Gromov was the main sponsor. A stage was set up in the central square, music was playing, and crowds of people with children were walking around. The highlight of the holiday was supposed to be Gromov's speech. And then, when he, beaming and satisfied, climbed onto the stage to the applause of the crowd, police cars arrived at the square from several sides at once. They were not local, but from the regional special forces. Igor Belov, accompanied by masked fighters, climbed right onto the stage. "Citizen Gromov," he said loudly and clearly into the microphone that the mayor had been holding a second ago. "You are under arrest on suspicion of cruelty to animals and organizing an illegal betting ring." Silence fell over the square. For a second, it seemed as if even the music had stopped on its own. Thousands of eyes, which a moment ago had been looking at the stage with adoration and respect, were now fixed on the figure of Igor Belov and the handcuffs that had clicked onto Stepan Gromov's wrists. The mayor, standing next to him, froze with his mouth open, his congratulatory speech frozen mid-sentence. Gromov's face turned from benevolent and radiant to crimson, distorted with rage and bewilderment. "What are you doing, Lieutenant?" He growled so loudly that his voice carried across the square, even without a microphone. "Do you know who I am? I'll crush you." Igor did not flinch. His face was completely calm. "The investigator will explain all your rights to you. Let's get in the car." The Special Forces soldiers politely but firmly took Gromov by the arms. The crowd came to its senses. A murmur ran through it, like the sound of a disturbed beehive. Someone gasped, some took out their phones and started filming, and some shouted indignantly that it was a provocation. But no one dared to intervene. The sight of armed men in masks had a sobering effect. When Gromov was put into the car and the motorcade set off with its sirens blaring, the square exploded with thousands of voices. The holiday was irretrievably ruined. Instead of joy, there was confusion, shock, and fear in the air. The entire familiar world of Zarachensk, in which Stepan Gromov was an unshakable constant, collapsed in an instant. Arseny Petrovich saw none of this. At that moment, he was changing the horse's bedding. He heard the distant wail of sirens, but didn't think much of it. It could have been anything. He found out what had happened from Anna. She arrived at the farm in the evening, her face agitated. "Have you heard?" she asked instead of greeting him. Arseny shook his head. Anna told him everything in minute detail. Arseny listened silently, his face impassive. When she finished, he stared into the distance for a long time, at Zarya and Burin grazing. There was no triumph or malice in his eyes. There was only quiet, heavy fatigue, and enormous relief. "Now they're safe," he said so quietly that Anna could barely hear him. He wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about the horses. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about Gromov, revenge, or justice. He was only thinking about how the threat hanging over the 2 lives he had saved had finally passed. Anna put her hand on his shoulder. "You did everything right, Petrovich. You're a real man." He just smiled bitterly. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who simply couldn't walk away from someone else's pain and now had to live with the consequences of that choice. While the city buzzed with talk of the arrest, a second group of investigators, including Igor Belov, was already working at Gromov's estate. It wasn't just a wealthy mansion. It was a veritable fortress with high fences and cameras all around the perimeter. Based on the testimony of the former stableman, they headed not to the main stable, where the well-groomed show horses stood, but to a distant, unremarkable hangar in the back of the property. The door was locked with a heavy barn lock. When it was cut open, a sharp smell of medicine and ammonia hit their noses. Inside, a horrific scene awaited them. It was a secret slaughterhouse. Other horses stood in several cramped stalls, emaciated, with dull eyes. In the corner lay homemade whips with wire woven into them and special weights for the legs, causing the animals to suffer with every step. But the main find was a small refrigerator in the back room. It was filled to the brim with illegal stimulants, growth hormones, and powerful painkillers. Next to it, in a trash can, lay used syringes. And in the manager's desk, investigators found what became the final nail in the coffin of Gromov's reputation: accounting books and notebooks with records of bets on underground horse races. The sums were astronomical. This discovery was the second shockwave that hit Zarachensk. News of the secret stable and the cruel treatment of other animals spread instantly. Now even Gromov's most ardent defenders fell silent. The image of a generous patron crumbled to dust, revealing the face of a ruthless and greedy businessman. The initial shock in the city was replaced by confusion. People who had worked for Gromov for years did not know what would happen next. Business partners hastily began to sever all ties with him. Panic reigned in the local administration. Everyone understood that the investigation could lead to a whole chain of bribes and illegal decisions signed under pressure from Gromov. The city, which had lived by his rules, found itself in a vacuum. People began to remember missing livestock from small farmers, strange fires in the fields of competitors, sudden inspections of those who dared to contradict him. Everything that people had previously been afraid to even whisper about was now being discussed on every street corner. And at the center of all this talk, oddly enough, was Arseny Petrovich. His name was now spoken with respect. The man who had gone against the system alone and won. His farm became a place of pilgrimage. People came just to see him and his legendary horses. Some brought gifts, others offered to help with the farm work. Arseny, unaccustomed to such attention, was lost and embarrassed. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was now perceived not as the sullen mood of a recluse, but as the wise dignity of a strong man. Arseny tried to live his old life, but it was no longer possible. One morning, a car with the logo of a regional television channel pulled up at his gate. A pushy journalist tried to interview him, shoving a microphone in his face and asking loud questions about his heroic struggle. Arseny turned away silently and went into the house. He didn't want to be part of this show. The only person with whom he felt at ease was Anna. She came every evening, bringing food and the latest news. They sat on the porch, drank tea, and watched Zarya and Burin graze peacefully in the meadow. "You know," Anna said one day, "they've changed completely. Zarya is no longer afraid of every little noise, and there's a sparkle in Buran's eyes." Arseny nodded. "We've all changed," he replied quietly. Their friendship, forged by these events, imperceptibly grew into something more. They were both lonely people, scarred by the past, and unexpectedly found a kindred spirit in each other. For the first time in many years, Arseny felt that his home was becoming a home again, not just a place to sleep. But Gromov wouldn't be Gromov if he gave up so easily. Even in the detention center, he remained dangerous. Expensive lawyers arrived from the regional center. Their strategy was simple and dirty. They started an information war. Their main target was a key witness, a former stableman. In paid articles on the internet, he was portrayed as a vengeful alcoholic who had framed his former employer out of resentment for being fired. Pressure was put on his family with anonymous phone calls. Then they went after Igor Belov. He was portrayed as a careerist who would stop at nothing to get a few stars on his epaulettes, and who had fabricated a case against a respected man. Arseny was not spared either. Rumors spread that he himself had stolen the thoroughbred horses in order to demand a ransom from Gromov. And when the plan failed, he decided to frame him. The lies were monstrous, but they worked. Some people in the city began to have doubts again. Igor understood that the lawyers were stalling for time, trying to break the case before it went to trial. He hurried to secure the evidence, but he felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Gromov, like a wounded animal, was twice as dangerous. Late one night, Arseny was awakened by an alarming sound. It wasn't a snort or a neigh. It was a panicked snore, full of terror, coming from the pasture. Arseny jumped out of bed, his heart pounding wildly. He threw on his jacket, grabbed an old double-barreled shotgun that he hadn't held in his hands for many years, and ran out into the street. The night was dark and moonless. He ran to the corral and saw that the section of the fence closest to the forest was broken. The posts had been torn out, the wire cut. The horses were huddled together in the far corner of the paddock, their eyes shining wildly in the light of the flashlight. Arseny froze. He shone the flashlight toward the forest, trying to see anything in the darkness. There was no response, not a sound, not a movement. But he felt with every fiber of his being that someone was there, in the shadows of the trees. Someone who had come not just to scare them. Someone who had come to finish what Stepan Gromov had started. He raised his rifle, and the echo of the cocked triggers rang out in the night. "Who's there?" Arseny's voice sounded hoarse and hollow, dissolving into the darkness of the night. The only response was a tense silence, broken by the heavy breathing of frightened horses. He stood motionless, staring into the inky wall of the forest, feeling cold sweat trickling down his back. He didn't know if there was one person or several, whether they were armed. But he knew for sure that they had come for Zarya and Burin. It was Gromov's style, to act through others, brazenly and cruelly. Several agonizing minutes passed. Nothing broke the silence. Perhaps they had been scared off by the light of the lantern and the click of the rifle. But Arseny was in no hurry to lower his weapon. He slowly circled the corral, carefully examining every bush and every shadow. Finally, satisfied that there was no immediate threat, he returned to the horses. They were still trembling. Zarya pressed herself against him, hiding her head behind his back like a small child. He stood with them for a long time, stroking their necks soothingly and talking quietly until their trembling subsided. Only at dawn, when the sky began to lighten in the east, did he, staggering with fatigue and tension, lead them into the barn, which now seemed the only safe place. Locking the heavy door with a bolt, he sat down on a haystack, resting his rifle on his knees, and realized that he would not be able to sleep peacefully anymore. The war that he thought he had won had, in fact, only just begun. In the morning, he called Igor Belov. The district police officer arrived with a task force. They examined the broken fence, found tire tracks on the forest road, and several blurred footprints. Igor was gloomier than the clouds. "It's his people, Petrovich. No doubt about it," he said, studying the tracks. "They're trying to destroy the evidence. The horses are the main piece of evidence against him. No horses, no case." Arseny nodded silently. "What now?" he asked. "Now we'll do things differently," Igor replied decisively. "Enough defending ourselves. We'll get them out of here, temporarily." Igor's plan was simple and logical. The horses had to be taken to a safe place under round-the-clock guard until the trial. He made arrangements with an equestrian school in the regional center. It had good conditions for the animals and was a secure area. For Arseny, this news came as a blow. He had grown so attached to them that the thought of parting was unbearable. But he understood that Igor was right. Here, on his unprotected farm, they were sitting ducks. In the evening, a special van arrived to transport the horses. The farewell was difficult. Burin calmly walked up the ramp, trustingly following Igor. But Zarya resisted. She clung to Arseny, unwilling to take a step. He had to lead her into the truck himself, and when the door closed behind her, she let out a plaintive, mournful neigh. Arseny stood and watched the departing vehicle, and the deafening silence that he seemed to have forgotten returned to his farm. The emptiness that returned with renewed force was almost physically palpable. The departure of the horses did not go unnoticed. Gromov's lawyers immediately took advantage of this, presenting it as if the police had confiscated the animals to hide the fact that Arseny himself had stolen them. The information attack resumed. Arseny once again found himself at the center of dirty rumors. Some of yesterday's well-wishers now looked at him with suspicion. He had to withdraw into himself again, as in the old days. His only support was Anna. She saw how hard he was taking the separation and tried to be there for him. "Hang in there, Petrovich," she said. "The trial is coming soon. Everything will be cleared up and you'll bring them home." But Arseny was afraid to believe her. He knew too well that money and power could work any kind of miracle in court. Meanwhile, Igor Belov, realizing that the case could fall apart, took a risky step. He decided to find another witness. Gromov's notes, found in his office, often mentioned a veterinary clinic that issued huge bills for consultations. Igor assumed that it was the doctor at this clinic who could have been supplying Gromov with illegal drugs. He arrived at the clinic unannounced. The head doctor, seeing the police officer with a warrant, initially denied everything. But when Igor showed him copies of the bills and threatened to charge him with complicity, he broke down. He confessed that he had been supplying Gromov with stimulants and hormones for a year, knowing full well what they were being used for. He was ready to give official testimony in exchange for witness status rather than that of a defendant. This was a powerful trump card in the hands of the investigation. Now they had two witnesses and irrefutable material evidence. The news of the appearance of a new witness finally undermined Gromov's position. His lawyers realized that it was pointless to deny anything further. They changed tactics, trying to negotiate a deal with the investigators, to admit guilt on lesser charges in order to avoid a long prison term. But Igor and his superiors, sensing the public outcry, were determined to see it through to the end. The trial date was set. Arseny Petrovich was summoned as the main victim and witness. On the day of the trial, he put on his only decent jacket, which had been hanging in his closet since his wife's funeral. In the courtroom, he saw Gromov for the first time since his arrest. He had changed a lot. He had lost weight, looked haggard, and his former self-confidence had disappeared. He sat in the fishbowl for the defendants and stared at the floor. He never once looked up at Arseny. The trial was high profile. Journalists from regional and even federal publications filled the courtroom. The testimony of the former stablemen, the veterinarian, and the expert reports all painted a terrible picture of a ruthless system built by one man. But the most powerful moment came when Arseny took the stand. He didn't say anything dramatic. He simply, in his quiet, unassuming way, described how he found two dying animals in an abandoned barn. He described their condition, their fear, their slow return to life. He did not speak as an accuser. He spoke as a man who had witnessed monstrous cruelty and could not walk away. His simple, heartfelt words made a much greater impression on the judge and jury than the speeches of the prosecutor and defense attorneys. When he finished, there was silence in the courtroom for several seconds. The climax came when Zarya was brought into the courtroom as material evidence. She was brought in under guard from an equestrian school. When the bailiff opened the door and a beautiful, graceful bay horse entered the courtroom, everyone gasped. She was no longer a starving skeleton, but a magnificent, strong animal. She looked around fearfully, pricking up her ears at unfamiliar sounds. At that moment, Arseny, without waiting for the judge's permission, rose from his seat and slowly walked toward her. "Quiet, my dear. Quiet, Zarya. It's me," he said softly. Hearing his voice, the horse stopped trembling. She turned her head toward him and whinnied softly, nudging his chest. This scene, unfolding before the eyes of the entire court, became a vivid illustration of everything that had been said earlier. It was more eloquent than any evidence. Even Gromov's lawyers bowed their heads. After that, the outcome of the case was a foregone conclusion. Stepan Viktorovich Gromov was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to a real term of imprisonment. His agricultural holding was ordered to pay a huge fine. The empire of the master of the city had finally collapsed. When Arseny left the courthouse, he was surrounded by a crowd. People applauded, shook his hand, and thanked him. He was embarrassed and confused. Anna and Igor stood next to him. "We won, Petrovich." Igor smiled. "You won," Anna corrected him, looking at Arseny with undisguised admiration. At that moment, an unfamiliar man in an expensive suit approached them. "Arseny Petrovich?" he asked. "My name is Andrei Nikolaevich. I am the former owner of this horse." The man explained that he had sold Zvezda Rasveta, believing that she would not survive her injury. He had sold her to a dealer, unaware that he worked for Gromov. He had been following the case and was shocked by the whole story. "I want her to stay with you," said Andrei Nikolaevich. "I can see how attached you are to her. I'll take care of all the paperwork. It's the least I can do to make up for my mistake." Arseny didn't know what to say. He just nodded, unable to believe his luck. That evening, Zarya and Burin returned to the farm. When the van door opened and they stepped onto their native soil, their joy knew no bounds. They ran around the meadow, prancing and playing like foals. Arseny stood on the porch with Anna and watched them. The clouds that had been gathering over his head for so long finally dispersed. A new life lay ahead. But he did not yet know that the most important shock for the whole town was still to come. And it was not connected with Gromov, but with what was discovered after his arrest. Life on the farm settled into a peaceful routine. After the high-profile trial and the return of the horses, there was a period of calm that Arseny had been longing for. He woke up with the first rays of the sun, worked on the farm, and spent his evenings sitting on the porch with Anna, who had become an integral part of his new life. The emptiness in his home and in his soul was gradually filled with quiet happiness. Zarya and Burin finally recovered and became the true masters of the pasture. Their presence was a constant reminder that even from the deepest darkness, it is possible to emerge into the light. The town of Zarechensk also slowly recovered from the shock. Gromov's agricultural holding company was placed under external management. A dry and businesslike administrator appointed from the region began bankruptcy proceedings and an audit of all assets. For most residents, these were just dry lines in the local newspaper, far removed from their everyday concerns. They were convinced that the worst was behind them. How wrong they were. The first alarm bell rang one day in August. An inconspicuous government car pulled up at the gate of Arseny's farm. A middle-aged man in a strict suit and carrying a briefcase got out. He introduced himself as a lawyer representing the bankruptcy administrator of the Zarya Agricultural Holding Company. His tone was polite but cold. He handed Arseny an official notice. Arseny squinted in the sun and scanned the official lines, and the ground disappeared from under his feet. The document stated in dry legal language that, according to the results of an audit, the land on which his farm was located was the property of the Zarya Agricultural Holding Company. His old land documents, issued back in the 1990s, had allegedly been canceled in a dubious transaction 10 years ago. Now, as part of bankruptcy proceedings, the land, along with all the buildings, was to be appraised and subsequently sold at auction to pay off the company's debts. Arseny Petrovich was ordered to vacate the property within 30 days. Arseny just stared at the paper, unable to believe what was happening. His grandfather had built this house. This land had belonged to his family for almost 100 years. He had not entered into any transactions. He had not sold anything. This must be some kind of mistake, was all he could mutter. The lawyer shrugged indifferently. All the documents are in order. Stepan Viktorovich Gromov carried out a large-scale restructuring of land assets at the time. Many transactions were carried out through shell companies or using powers of attorney that the owners may not have been aware of. You should consult a lawyer, but I'm afraid you don't stand much of a chance. The law is on the creditor's side. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Arseny alone with a piece of paper that had just crossed out his entire life. The shock was so strong that he didn't even feel anger, only an icy, all-consuming emptiness, much worse than the one he felt after the death of his family. Back then, he lost his future. Now they were taking away his past. He didn't immediately understand the scale of the disaster. He thought it only concerned him, that it was Gromov's personal revenge from behind bars. But the next day, when he went to the city for groceries, he saw that he wasn't the only one in trouble. People were standing outside the store, his neighbors, confusedly discussing identical letters. It turned out that Gromov, using his power and connections, had been running a monstrous scam for many years. Through complex schemes, bribed officials, and notaries, he had secretly transferred dozens, if not hundreds, of land plots in Zarichensk and its surroundings to his agricultural holding. People continued to live in their homes, work on their land, and pay taxes, unaware that they had long since become homeless in the eyes of the law. And now, with Gromov's empire in ruins, this sleeping monster has awakened. The banks and creditors to whom Gromov owed billions wanted their money back. And they didn't give a damn about the fate of the people living on this land. That was the real shock. Not the cruelty to animals, not the underground betting rings, but the cold, calculated robbery of an entire town, which only came to light after the dictator's arrest. Panic gripped Zarichensk. People rushed to the administration, to the cadastral office, but everywhere they came up against a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The documents are in order. Everything is legal, the officials replied, afraid to admit their own complicity or negligence. The city was plunged into despair. Old people who had lived in their homes all their lives cried in the streets. Young families who had just built houses on their land looked to the future in horror. Igor Belov tried to help, but it was no longer within his power. The criminal case against Gromov had been closed, and the verdict had been handed down. And this was now a civil matter. "There's nothing I can do, Petrovich," he said sadly to Arseny. "This has to be settled in court. But it will be long, expensive, and there's no guarantee of success. They have the best lawyers hired by the banks." It seemed there was no way out. People were ready to give up, to accept that they would simply be thrown out onto the street. They were used to obeying force, and the force of the law and money seemed even more frightening than Gromov's power. And then something unexpected happened. One evening, people began to gather at Arseny's farm. First a few neighbors, then more and more. They came in cars and on foot. They didn't hold a rally or shout slogans. They just stood at his gate in a silent, confused crowd. Their eyes held their last hope. They came to him, to the man who wasn't afraid to go against Gromov, to the only one who proved that it was possible and necessary to fight. They didn't know what to do, and instinctively turned to the one who had shown them an example of strength of spirit. Anna came out onto the porch with Arseny. "They've come to you," she said quietly. "They believe in you." Arseny looked at the dozens of faces turned toward him. Faces of familiar and unfamiliar people, united by a common misfortune. He, a recluse and a hermit who had spent his entire life fleeing society, suddenly found himself at its center. He did not want this role. He did not want to be a leader or a hero. He just wanted to live out his life in peace on his land, with his horses and the woman he loved. But looking into the eyes of these people, full of fear and desperate hope, he realized that his quiet life was over before it had even begun. His war was not over. It had simply changed the battlefield. Now he had to fight not only for his horses, he had to fight for his home, for his neighbors, for his entire town. Arseny glanced around at the crowd. Dozens of pairs of eyes looked at him with desperate pleading. These people, his neighbors, whom he had avoided for decades, now saw in him, the silent recluse, their last hope. At that moment, he realized that his personal story was over. The history of an entire city was beginning, and by the will of fate, he was to write its first chapter. He took a step forward. The crowd froze. "Go home," he said in his usual quiet voice. "Tomorrow morning, to my place. We'll think about it." There was no pathos or promises in his words, but there was firmness in them. Silently, with a new determination in their eyes, the people began to disperse. When the last person disappeared around the corner, Arseny turned to Anna. "I don't know what to do," he admitted honestly. "You've already done the most important thing," she replied, taking his hand. "You gave them hope. Now let's really think about what to do next." That night, for the first time in many years, the lights stayed on until morning at the old farm. Arseny, Anna, Igor Belov, who had arrived immediately after the phone call, and a couple of the most respected neighbors sat at the kitchen table. They considered various options, but each one led to a dead end. Suing the banks was hopeless. Asking for help from the local authorities, mired in Gromov's corruption, was pointless. "We can't beat them on their turf, in the courts and offices," Igor finally said. "Then we need to change the battlefield." The idea came unexpectedly. It was Anna who suggested it, remembering the response to the first video of Zarya running across the field. "People from all over the country sympathized with the two horses," she said. "Will they really remain indifferent to the fate of an entire city?" The plan was bold and risky. They had to make their story known to the whole country. They had to tell it not to officials and judges, but to ordinary people. Arseny resisted at first. The thought of cameras and journalists was repugnant to him. But when he looked out the window at his house, at the land where his ancestors lay, he realized he had no choice. He found the number of the pushy journalist from the regional TV channel who had come to see him after the trial. Her reaction was immediate. She understood that this was not just local news. It was a bombshell. 2 days later, a film crew from a federal channel arrived in Zarachensk. Arseny's farm became the main filming location. He stood in front of the camera, awkward, dressed in his simple work clothes. Behind him, Zarya and Burin grazed peacefully. He didn't try to play to the camera. He just told his story. He talked about how he found the horses, how he nursed them back to health, how he fought for them. And then he took out the eviction notice. "First they wanted to take them away from me," he said, looking straight into the camera. "And now they want to take our homes away from us. This land, our past. We're not asking for mercy. We're asking for justice." His story became the backbone of the report. Journalists went around the city recording other people's stories. An old woman showed a photo of her husband, with whom she had built their house after the war. A young couple with a child in their arms stood next to an unfinished cottage on which they had spent all their savings. Dozens of real, living stories, united by a single misfortune. The report aired during prime time on Sunday evening. and it blew up the news cycle. The story of how efficient managers and banks, hiding behind the law, were evicting an entire town deceived by an oligarch sentenced to a long prison term caused a storm of public anger. Social media was boiling. The hashtag #JockerSaveZarachensky went viral. This was one of those cases where quantity turned into quality. The story became so high profile that it could no longer be ignored. The next day, the State Duma commented on the situation. The Prosecutor General's office announced the launch of an investigation into the legality of all land deals concluded by Gromov's agricultural holding over the past 15 years. The regional governor, who was facing a huge political scandal, rushed to Zarachensk. He gathered residents in the very square where Gromov had been arrested a few months earlier, and publicly promised that no one would be evicted from their homes. All eviction orders were immediately suspended. It was a victory, deafening and unconditional, a victory not of force or money, but of public opinion and human solidarity. People in the square cried and hugged each other. They carried the embarrassed Arseny on their shoulders, who once again did not feel like a hero. He felt only immense relief that the nightmare was over. A long and complex investigation began, which uncovered layers of corruption in the district and regional administrations. Many officials were dismissed, and criminal cases were opened against some. The process of annulling illegal transactions took almost a year, but in the end, justice prevailed. Every resident got back their legal documents for their land. Life in Zarachensk slowly returned to normal, but the city had changed forever. People became more united and confident in their abilities. They realized that together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Arseny Petrovich's farm became a local landmark, a symbol of this victory. He often had guests, and to his surprise, he no longer found this burdensome. He learned to communicate with people again and find joy in it. Anna moved in with him permanently. Her energy and his calm wisdom complemented each other perfectly. They ran the farm together and took care of the horses, which had become almost like children to them. The story came to an end on a quiet summer evening, exactly 1 year after those terrible events. Arseny and Anna were sitting on the porch of their house. Zarya and Burin grazed in the meadow, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Arseny looked at them and thought about the strange and unpredictable path he had traveled. He, a lonely farmer, had only wanted to save 2 tortured horses. And in the end, without even meaning to, he had saved an entire town. But most importantly, he had finally saved himself from loneliness, despair, and the past that had tormented him for so long. He had found a home, a family, and a reason to live again. And looking at the woman next to him and the 2 beautiful animals, he knew that he would never lose them again. Do you think Arseny did the right thing by getting involved in the fight for the entire city? Or should he have focused solely on saving his farm?